Chapter 6. Tackling the laundry the next morning was one of the most disgusting things Ada had ever had to do. Wade hadn't been kidding about how long it had been since he'd laundered his things, and she wished she could wash everything all at once, but she was fully aware her new husband couldn't work in the buff, though the idea of it amused her a bit. As soon as the laundry was hanging on the line, she went inside and scrubbed the table. She was making bread, and her grandmother had always told her that no matter how clean she thought the table was, she needed to wash it again before baking bread. Already she was feeling sore in every muscle of her body, and she wanted to take a day off to just lounge around and do some needlework, but that's not what a rancher's wife did. She had work to do every day of her life, and she would do it to the best of her ability. She baked the bread, setting it in a bowl to rise, and then scrubbed her table again. Then she sat down and looked around her. She needed to find places for all the belongings she'd brought with her from Beckham, so that would be her next project. But first, she had to make lunch for a hungry man. She took the last of the shepherd's pie from the icebox, and she put it into the oven to warm it up. She was planning a pot roast for supper that night, so she would need to start that shortly after lunch was finished. When Wade came home for lunch, he washed his hands and then lifted the towel from the bowl of bread dough. "Are you making fresh bread?" he asked. "I haven't had fresh bread since I moved to my own place." "I am. I hope it comes out right. I baked bread a dozen times with my grandmother over my shoulder, but I've never done it alone." "I'm sure it will be delicious," he said. "You have more confidence in me than I do." She grinned at him. "Are you still working on fences?" "Today, I'm letting the calves do as they want, and I'm taking the entire herd across the river. This is a job that would be better if I had some ranch hands to help me, but I'm not willing to pay for them. Not yet anyway." He was already stretching his income by having her there, but he didn't tell her that. Ada smiled. "Maybe next time, you'll ask your wife for help. You'll be surprised at what a good horsewoman I am." "Nothing about you will surprise me," he said, taking a seat at the table. She pulled the shepherd's pie from the oven and put 2 servings on one plate and 1 serving on another. Wade's huge appetite had not escaped her notice. Giving his plate to him, she sat down on the side of the table beside him. He said a quick prayer, and they both began eating, with her telling him how much life she'd gone through that morning. "I'm going to have to put more on my list the next time I go to the store. I have enough for a couple normal weeks of washing, but not much more than that." He gave her a sheepish grin. "Mrs. Royal offered to do it for me, but I couldn't be a burden to her, so I said I'd take care of it myself. Now, if I just had." She laughed. "Most of it is done now. I just need to tackle what you're wearing, and then it will feel as if you have clean clothes all the time. You must have 6 pairs of pants." "I kept buying more when I didn't have time to wash them. Stupid plan, and I regret it now, but I didn't know what else to do. It's all handled now. At least until next week. I think I'm going to make Fridays my wash days." He finished his meal and dropped a kiss on her forehead. "Great job doing the wash. I'm looking forward to that bread." "Don't get your hopes up too high," she said as he disappeared out the door. She did dishes and scrubbed the table once again before punching down the bread and dividing it into loaves. She was making 3 loaves, 1 per day through Sunday. She only hoped it would last that long around Wade. Once she had the loaves in the oven and had prepped the pot roast for that evening, she sat down at the table and cut out her first dress. She'd brought a simple pattern from the newspaper with her, one her grandmother had given her ages ago, and used it to cut each piece carefully. Sewing was another thing she'd only done with her grandmother watching. Her mother had never allowed her to do it at home, because she said that's what modistes were for. The entire afternoon was spent sewing, with her getting up a few times to remove bread from the oven and putting the pot roast in. Sewing was difficult, long, and tedious work in Ada's eyes, but she knew she needed to do it. Hiring a modiste just wasn't an option anymore. Shortly before 6, when she knew Wade would be home, Ada put the sewing on top of her trunk, only then realizing she should have emptied it before she started sewing. That would have to go on her list for the next day again, but all was well. Wade didn't care if she put her things away, she was certain. She made a simple gravy her grandmother had taught her, and she had everything on the table waiting when Wade walked in. She'd even sliced the bread and tried a small piece. It wasn't as good as her grandmother's, but it was certainly better than her mother's cooks. She couldn't complain. Wade's face lit up when he walked in the door and saw everything on the table, waiting for him. He was obviously tired from a difficult day at work, but he was pleased with the food. How did the bread turn out? She shrugged. Could be better. Could be worse. I can't wait to try it. He looked at the ball of butter on the table. Did you have time to churn butter, or did you buy some yesterday? I bought some yesterday. I did notice the churn though, and I'm sure I'll try my hand at churning butter next week. I don't want to have to keep paying good money for it when I can easily make it myself. Churning butter is hard work, he warned. Your arms will be very sore before you're done. I'm sure they will, Ada said. That's all right though. My whole body aches right now. She laughed, shaking her head. I thought I was ready for this kind of work, but apparently, you're never quite ready. No, you do have to get used to it. It sounds like you only really worked on weekends before coming here, and only when your mother didn't have a dance for you to go to. That's true. I only got to her one weekend a month or so. She sat down and served her plate. I've never made a pot roast on my own before either. I hope it's good. I'm sure it's delicious. He had no doubt she could make a wonderful meal. The girl seemed to be able to do anything she put her mind to. He served his own plate and put 2 pieces of bread on it, both of them slathered with butter. I don't even want to wait until after our prayer to try this bread, so we're praying fast. True to his word, his prayer was so fast that Ada couldn't help but giggle. You want to try the bread that badly? It's been so long, he said, taking a big bite of the bread. This is heaven. I don't care if you think it's not perfect. He groaned a little, taking another big bite. Now you just need to buy honey or learn to make jam. I'd be happy with either. She frowned. I've never made jam. How am I going to learn? He took a big swallow of his bread before cutting up his meat. Mrs. Royal will teach you. Have you gone over there and introduced yourself yet? No, I haven't. I'll try to do that tomorrow. Her father didn't work Saturdays, but she was certain Wade would. His job didn't allow him 2 days off in the middle of the summer. Or any other time for that matter. You should. You'll love Cassandra, but her mother-in-law, Miriam Royal, is the best cook around. You go work with her when she's ready to make jam, and I'm sure you'll be great in no time. When is it time to cook jam? She asked. Wade thought for a moment. Right about now. The huckleberries are blooming, and there are raspberries and other berries ripe. Go over there tomorrow and tell them you want to learn to make jam. I'm sure they'll send you to their bushes, and let you pick your own berries, and then teach you to make jam. Just tell them you're my wife, and you came from Beckham, just like Cassandra did. She nodded. It feels strange to talk to strangers and expect them to help me. He smiled. A year ago, I couldn't read. Cassandra taught me. Trust me, these are amazing people. And once you learn, you can teach our daughters. I like the idea of having daughters, she said with a big smile. I can teach them how to keep house and cook. But if they want to be ladies, what will you do? He asked, wiping his mouth. She sighed. I'll probably send them to my mother. Good. Even if it's not the life you wanted, they should be able to live the life they want if it's possible. Of course. I'm sure my mother would love that. She hadn't thought about the children she would have when she'd hopped on a train. Perhaps she'd made an error in judgment, because her children wouldn't be raised with all the wealth and privilege she'd had. Wouldn't that be within their rights? Don't worry about it. We don't even know if you'll have any girls. She smiled, but the smile looked distant to him. I'm sorry if I made you think about something you're not ready to think about. It's perfectly all right. I'm sure whatever children we have will be happy with their lives. She stood up and did the dishes. I hope you won't mind having this for lunch again tomorrow. It will be much easier for me if I can cook 2 meals a day and heat up what's left from the night before for our noon meals. I think that's a wonderful idea. He took a sip of the milk she had on the table for him. What did you do this afternoon? He asked. I made supper and baked the bread. And I started working on my first dress. Are you enjoying sewing? She laughed. It was a great deal more fun with my grandmother sitting beside me, reminding me what to do at each step. I can understand that. I'm glad you had her. As soon as the dishes were done, she gathered her sewing and sat beside him, working on her stitching. He watched her for a moment, and then leaned back in his chair. That color will be beautiful on you. She chuckled, looking at him through her eyelashes. Flattery? We're already married, Wade. He grinned. Doesn't mean I don't want you to think of me as the best husband you could possibly have. I already do, she said softly, stabbing her needle into the dress. I really need a sewing machine. They do the work in a fraction of the time. Grandmother showed them to me. He frowned. They sound expensive. They are, but I still have some money. I'm sure it's enough for a sewing machine if you wouldn't mind if I bought it. Wade sighed. Are you going to be someone who needs to always be spending money? Not at all. My mother had to drag me to the stores to get me to shop with her. It's just something that would make my life a great deal easier, and I have the money to do it. I also have jewelry I can sell if we need more money. He shook his head. No selling your jewelry. Why not? She asked. Everything I have is ours now. Why not use it to make our lives better? Are our lives not good enough for you? Ada frowned. You're taking everything I say wrong. Our lives are wonderful. But mine would be easier if I had a sewing machine. We'll have children, and I'll want to be able to make clothes for them. You'll need new shirts. I'll need new dresses. If I buy a sewing machine now, it will be used for all those things, and we'll get the most use out of it. She shook her head. If it bothers you so much, I won't do it though. Will it really help you as much as you say? He asked. It will. My grandmother would probably be faster than any machine, but I am not. I don't have the kind of experience she has. Against his better judgment, Wade nodded. Buy one tomorrow then, if that's what you want to do. He couldn't help but wonder how often she'd feel the need to spend her own money for things. He hoped it wouldn't be often. Chapter 7. Saturday morning, after doing her chores for the day, Ada went to the Royals' ranch to meet and discuss jam making with Cassandra and Mrs. Royal. Cassandra opened the door, her new baby against her shoulder. Hello. Ada smiled, surprised at how very nervous she was. I'm Ada Kelso. I married Wade a few days back. Cassandra smiled, but it was a tired smile. Come in. The baby is colicky, so if I don't seem excited to have a guest, that's why. I'm very happy you're here. She waved to a plump woman in her 50s. This is my mother-in-law, Miriam Royal. It'll be easier if you call me Cassandra, and call Miriam Mrs. Royal, if that's all right with you. I'd like that a lot. Cassandra sat down in one of the dining chairs, and Ada followed suit. I'm sorry if I came at a bad time. Cassandra shook her head. Not at all. I'm just sleepy, but I'd be sleepy even if you weren't here. Wade told me to come over and introduce myself. He said Mrs. Royal would teach me to make jam if I asked nicely. Mrs. Royal laughed. I will. You don't even have to ask nicely. But if you'd pick the berries for the jam, that would be well worth my time to teach you. What will I need? Ada asked, already excited. Wade had been right. These people were kind and eager to teach her things she needed to know. To pick the berries, you need a basket. You'll also need canning jars, but I have more than enough for both of our households, if you don't mind using mine. Not at all. Ada said with a smile. I plan to go to the store today, though, so maybe I should buy some? Don't. Really, there's no need. Mrs. Royal sat down at the table as well. What do you need from the store? A sewing machine, Ada said. I'm not as good of a seamstress as I thought I was before coming here. Cassandra laughed. I'm a gardener. Mrs. Royal does all the real work around here. I think gardening is real work. I just feel like it's too late in the season for me to put one in. It probably is, but our garden is huge. I spent a great deal of my pregnancy working on planting and weeding. I'll need help harvesting, but if you come and help me, you can have some of the food. Will that work? I just can't do it all with little Carter. He's a needy baby. I can do all the harvesting for a share of the food. They were your seeds, and you planted and weeded. Ada eyed the baby with longing. Soon, she'd have a child of her own, but it never felt like it would be soon enough. He's beautiful. Cassandra smiled. I think so. I just wish he'd sleep a little more and feel the need to nurse a little less. Ada wanted to ask 100 questions about nursing, but she didn't feel like she knew the other woman well enough yet. Besides, it would be at least 9 months before she had to think about nursing a baby. Do you need anything from the store in Cauldron Valley while I'm there today? She asked. Mrs. Royal sat down and wrote out a short list. Mainly, we'll need sugar. If we're going to be making jam, then sugar is a necessity. I do have a few other things I was going to head to the store for next week, and I'd be grateful if you were able to get those for me. Just put them on our account. Ada accepted the list. I'll head home to make lunch for Wade, then go to the store. Could I pick berries on Monday? That would be wonderful, Mrs. Royal said with a smile. I'm looking forward to getting to know you and having berries to make jam from without having to pick them. I'm excited to learn. I helped my grandmother make them just once, but I don't remember anything except picking the berries. Well, it sounds like you helped when you were a child then. You're right. Cassandra was looking at Ada funny, and then her eyes widened. Are you Ada Applebottom? She asked. Well, I was, but not any longer. Ada felt fear run through her. She was recognized by someone who knew her maiden name. I remember I used to watch you and your mother out the window of the house where I was a nanny. You did? I'm certain we were not very interesting. I wasn't allowed to leave the house except to go to church and on my Sunday afternoons off. I wanted nothing more than to be able to walk freely. Ada frowned. You must have worked for the Randalls. They were always a little crazy when it came to their sons. Yes. Cassandra shook her head. I've been complaining about that family since I arrived in Montana, and I'm certain everyone thinks I'm crazy. I don't. Anyone who's met the Randalls wouldn't. They were the crazy ones. Ada shook her head. By the way, Mrs. Potter will be at church on Sunday. We want to find a time for us to get together. She seems to be homesick for Massachusetts, and we're just the people to help her with that. Cassandra's eyes brightened. I'd like that a lot. Everyone could come here. That would be wonderful. My house is a little small for company, seeing as it's all one big room. I've been there. I helped Wade move in. Wade says you also taught him to read. I thank you for that. Cassandra smiled. It was my pleasure. Wade has been a good friend to me since I arrived here. I'm glad you found a good friend so quickly, Ada said. I'm hoping you and I will be fast friends as well. And Mrs. Potter, Cassandra added. I've only met her once or twice, but I would love to get to know her better. She worked at the post office in Beckham until her father died. Oh. I know who she is then. Ada smiled. I talked to her a few times when my mother would allow me to walk far enough away from her to fetch the mail. Your mother was always at your side, wasn't she? She was. Every minute of every day. She wanted me to be a lady, just like her. I'm more of a farm girl sort. Ada realized she'd just told someone from Beckham where she was. My mother doesn't know where I am. I kind of disappeared in a train station, so if you could refrain from telling anyone in Beckham I'm here, that would be great. Mrs. Royal covered Ada's hand with her own. Your secret is safe here. There are many kinds of secrets, but I think most are necessary. Ada felt that Mrs. Royal understood needing to run away perfectly. She had to wonder what the other woman had been through. Late that afternoon, Ada returned to the Royals' house with the supplies Mrs. Royal had requested. When she was asked to supper, Ada shook her head. I have to get home and cook for Wade. We're asking both of you to supper, dear, Mrs. Royal said. Wade has eaten at our table many times over the years. Ada nodded, smiling. Then I'm sure we'd both love to come for supper. Thank you so much for the offer. I'll drive home and we'll be back at supper time. And I will be doing your dishes for you. She didn't wait for a response as she hurried out of the house and headed for home. It felt odd to call anywhere home but the huge house on Rock Creek Road, but she was happy there was a place that was hers and Wade's. When she arrived at home, she unloaded the wagon, but didn't bother to unhitch the team. What was the point if they were going to be leaving as soon as Wade got home anyway? Ada put everything away, excited to have her first supper invitation as a married woman. Certainly, she'd been invited many places for meals back in Massachusetts, but this was different. She wasn't being invited because of her parents, but because someone had liked her. It felt like she'd accomplished something. She was working on setting up the sewing machine when Wade came in from work. He stopped and frowned at her. Did you forget about supper? He asked. Ada shook her head. Of course not. Why did the man persist in thinking she would not do her job as his wife? The Royals invited us to supper tonight, and I accepted. I picked up supplies for them in Cauldron Valley as well, and since I was the one to spend the day driving, it made sense to accept. I see. And that's why the horses are still hitched to the wagon, he asked. It didn't seem prudent to unhitch them and then have to hitch them up again less than an hour later. I'm doing my best to do what makes sense. She got to her feet from her spot on the floor. I think I have the sewing machine almost ready to use. That's wonderful, he said. Did Mrs. Royal agree to teach you to make jam? She did. I need to pick the berries, but she'll teach me, we'll use her jars, and I'll get to bring some home. Sounds like a good arrangement. Wade walked toward the sink. Let me just wash my hands, and then I'll be ready to go. She smiled at him. You may want to wash your face as well. You have a big streak of dirt across it. He groaned. I hate it when that happens, but it's part of working outside with your hands. Within minutes, the two of them were headed to Royal River Ranch for supper. Cameron was waiting outside, and he reached out and shook hands with Wade. We miss you around here. Wade smiled. Some days I miss working here. It's hard to feel sure of where the next meal is going to come from now that I'm working for myself. Cameron clapped Wade on the back. I understand that completely. Come on. Ma has supper on the table, and I'm awfully hungry. Wade grinned, watching as Ada moved along beside him. This is my wife, Ada. Cameron nodded. Nice to meet you. I heard you made an impression on my wife and mother earlier. Ada smiled. I'm not quite sure how, but I won't complain. Cassandra was helping put the food on the table, and Ada realized it was the first time she'd seen her without the baby. Is the baby sleeping? Ada asked. Cassandra nodded. So, no one is speaking above a whisper at this meal, she said, looking at her husband as if she was certain he'd be the one to break her rule and wake the baby. I told you I'd be good, Cameron said, raising both hands in mock surrender. The evening turned out to be the best evening out Ada had ever had. There were no dancing or fancy meals, but the company was wonderful, and the food was good. She would be asking Mrs. Royal for some cooking lessons soon. The woman was a better cook than her grandmother, and Ada had never believed such a thing was possible. After the meal, Ada helped clean up, wiping the dishes, while Mrs. Royal washed them. Are you sure you won't let me finish the dishes alone? Ada asked. You cooked. And you drove to Cauldron Valley to get what I needed for supper. You're the heroine of the day, Ada. They sat and visited until it was almost 9, and then Wade stood. I hate to be the first to go, but there are chores that need to be done tonight, and again before church in the morning. We'll have to do this again soon. Ada nodded. Perhaps you could come to our house next time. Or I could cook something and bring it here if you'd rather. We'll see, Mrs. Royal said, smiling at her. I'm very happy that we have such a capable young woman near us now. Cassandra will love having a friend close by. Cassandra nodded, and Ada smiled. I'll love it too. And she heard the baby crying at just that moment. I think your presence is being requested. Of course, it is. Come back soon. As they drove home, Ada couldn't stop talking about how much she liked Cassandra. She lived 3 houses down from me in Massachusetts, but she was a nanny, and we never really got to talk. She told me today that she used to watch Mother and I walking down the street together. Mother insisted on healthful walks. Of course, she did. Wade stared straight ahead as he drove. It was dark, and it was much harder to see than usual. Are you certain she won't contact your parents and tell them where you are? I told her that I left without my mother's knowledge and asked that she not say anything to anyone in Beckham about me being here. Good, he said. I'm still a bit worried about what will happen when your mother realizes you are here. That's why she can't know until we're expecting. What if it takes you 5 years to be with child? Or more? She rested her head on his shoulder. I think we're trying to make a baby often enough that it shouldn't take long at all. He chuckled. I'm just glad you're enjoying it more now. Oh, I truly am. In fact, when we get home, I think we should try some more of that baby making. Wade smiled. I'll drive a little faster then. When they reached home, he unhitched the wagon, while she went inside to change for bed. Already, after just a few days in Montana, Ada felt like she was truly a wife. She spent time with a man she was growing to love, and he seemed to feel the same for her. She couldn't regret 1 minute of her decision to sneak away from her parents. Not when her life was just what she needed it to be. When Wade came back into the house, she went readily into his arms, so thankful for everything about this man. When she thought about the type of man she could have ended up married to, and she looked at Wade, she knew God had been looking out for her when she'd made the decision she did. Perhaps he even approved, though that seemed a little far-fetched. Soon, though, she'd be able to tell her parents, and she wouldn't have to worry about it any longer. But first, she had to have her way with her husband. Afterward, she lay with her head pillowed on his shoulder and sighed contentedly. You make being married and so far from home feel like a celebration. Thank you for being such a good husband to me. Wade could only think about the times he'd been certain she'd let him down, and he frowned. He was going to have to work harder to have confidence in his wife. Yes, she was young and came from a different background than he did, but that didn't mean she was going to fail at being a wife. To the contrary, he couldn't imagine anyone working harder with a more cheerful attitude. Now he would need to work on being cheerful as well. Chapter 8. Ada couldn't stop being nervous on the way to church the following morning. Everyone would surely know she'd run from her parents, and they would think her too young to be Wade's wife. She felt like every single shortcoming she had was written across her face. Thankfully, she had a beautiful dress to wear for the services, and she was happy to know she was going to get to meet Mrs. Potter. There were 3 of them in the area from Beckham now, and all of them felt as if invisible threads were pulling them together. Well, that's how Ada felt, and she imagined the others feeling the same. "What if everyone hates me?" she asked. Wade shrugged. "It won't matter to me, and you're my wife, not theirs. I worry no one will want to be my friend." He laughed. "The Potters are driving over from Cauldron Valley. You already have Cassandra and Mrs. Royal as friends. Are you one of those people who needs to be friends with everyone she meets?" Ada shook her head emphatically. "Not at all. I've never had a true close friend. There were acquaintances I was forced to spend time with because their mothers were friends with my mother, but I never fit into the lifestyle I was forced to lead. I care so much more about how people feel about me here than I ever did about how they felt about me back in Beckham." "Well, no one here will judge you, I don't think. I mean, there's always someone who isn't quite as kind as they could be, but you'll have 2 friends, just based on where you come from. I don't think it will be a worry at all." "Do you have a lot of friends here?" she asked. He shrugged. "A few. I would say Cameron Royal is my closest friend. We worked together for so long, we grew close whether either of us wanted it. He's a good man. Then I guess it's good that I like Cassandra so much. We'll be able to spend time together, and hopefully our children will become friends, and they'll end up married, and we'll share grandbabies. I hope that happens anyway." "Have you ever tried your hand at writing books?" he asked. "No, why do you ask?" "You have an amazing imagination." Since they were pulling into the churchyard, Ada managed to refrain from sticking her tongue out at her husband, but their proximity to the church and to other people was the only reason. She waited for Wade to come around and hand her down, though it was difficult for her to do. She wanted to just jump down and run away, but it wouldn't be ladylike, and though people here didn't put as much stock in being ladylike as her mother had, Sundays were the days to display your best manners. As soon as she was standing on the ground beside Wade, she smoothed the skirt of her dress down and took his arm. "I'm so nervous," she whispered. "You're going to do just fine." Walking toward the church, he nodded at several of the people there. One man stopped him. "Who is the beautiful woman on your arm?" The man looked at her. "Tell me you're not already married to him. You must give the rest of us a chance. I promise, you will like any other man in this church better than Wade." Wade sighed. "Go away, Buster. I need to escort my wife into the church." Buster groaned loudly. "How did you find her and marry her before any of the rest of us even got a chance to meet her?" "Just lucky, I guess. I heard Widow Watkins is looking to marry again. I wouldn't marry her for anything. She's strange. Have a good day, Buster." Wade walked away from the other man and into the church, whispering, "Buster is the town drunk. Trust me. You didn't want to marry him anyway." Mr. Potter and his wife made a beeline for them. She had a baby on one hip and a toddler by the hand. "You must be Ada. I'm so excited to meet you." Ada smiled. "I remember you from Beckham. You worked at the post office." Mrs. Potter's eyes widened. "I remember you too then. I was certain it couldn't be the Ada Applebottom I remember. How on earth did you get away from your mother?" Wade jerked at the woman's words. Perhaps he hadn't listened to Ada very well. If everyone in town knew she needed to get away from her mother, then she probably really did. "I may have run away in a train station. Ada wasn't proud of what she'd done, but she wasn't going to hide it either. Just don't use my former last name, and don't tell anyone in Beckham. Except Elizabeth Tandy, of course. Oh, Ada. I'm so sorry it had to come to that. Was she still making you go to all of those parties and try to find a husband who fit your station? Ada shuddered. She said that to me every single day. I know. I remember her scolding you on the street when you smiled at a man who wasn't suitable for you. Mrs. Potter shook her head. It was an awful situation for you. I'm Bridget, by the way. I don't know if we were ever truly introduced. I'm Ada. It's so good to meet you this way. Mrs. Royal and Cassandra have said that all of us from Beckham should get together. I would adore that. You could come to me, but I think it would be better if I came here. Then only one of us must travel, and Cassandra's baby is so little. Bridget looked around the church. I don't even see her here. The baby has colic, Ada said. She probably had to stay home just to sleep. Oh, dear. We'll definitely travel to her then. When is good for you? Ada shrugged. I'm happy with any time. I don't really know anyone other than the two of you, so anything works. I'm glad we're not so far apart that it's not possible. Not at all. Bridget smiled. I wish she was here to weigh in. Who do you want to be here? Came a voice from behind Ada. Ada spun to see Cassandra standing there. You, of course. Where's the baby? Cassandra smiled. I fed him right up until it was time to leave, so Miriam said she would sit with him this morning. I have to go straight home after church because that baby doesn't like not being attached to my breast, but at least I get a little time to be me and not be his mama. Bridget nodded emphatically. I understand those feelings quite well. I wish I had a wonderful, well-meaning mother-in-law around to watch my girls. I know how fortunate I am. Cassandra turned as Cameron came up behind her. I feel like we're newlyweds courting without the baby. I may have to sit with my husband and giggle a little. Cameron grinned. Carter's a special little person, though. He is. I'm just tired and a little silly feeling. The pastor cleared his throat then and they all hurried to find seats. Did you ladies work out a time for us to all get together then? Wade asked Ada as soon as they were seated. She shook her head. No, I suppose we'll have to talk about that after the service. Sounds good. Wade didn't really care much when they all met up. He liked the idea of spending some time with the other men, but it didn't matter too much to him when they did it. Ada smiled at a woman there with her son, who sat beside her. I'm Ada Kelso, she whispered. Charlotte Watkins, the woman whispered back. Welcome. Thank you. Ada turned then because the preacher was starting to talk, but she wanted to get to know Mrs. Watkins better. The sermon that week was about honoring your parents, and Ada wanted to sink straight through the pew onto the church floor. She hadn't meant to dishonor her parents, but the truth was, she had. After the service, Cassandra said, "Why don't we all just go to my house now? I know that Miriam is probably cooking up a huge meal that the three of us won't be able to eat, and then we can talk about ways to get together." I'd love that, Ada agreed. She'd planned to spend most of the day sewing, but she couldn't complain even a little bit about a reprieve. I would too, Bridget said. Is that all right with you, Felix? He nodded. We need to be home in time for me to do the milking, but other than that, I'm happy to be wherever you'd like. The 6 adults plus the 2 little girls took their 3 wagons and headed to the Royals' home. When they arrived, the house smelled absolutely divine. Cassandra hurried inside with Ada at her side. I invited 6 people for our Sunday dinner. I knew you would, Mrs. Royal said, smiling at Cassandra. I fixed dinner expecting 8 or so. Cassandra grinned at her mother-in-law. Have I told you yet today how much I love you? Have I told you how thrilled I am that you gave me a grandson? The women worked together and within minutes, they had the meal on the table. As they ate, they joked and laughed, and had a wonderful time. Wade couldn't help noticing that Ada was quiet. Much quieter than usual. He knew she'd gotten along well with the other men and women, so he had no idea what was wrong with her. "Are you okay?" he whispered when he was sure no one else was paying attention. She nodded. "I'm fine." But of course, she wasn't. She couldn't stop thinking about the pastor's words. She wasn't honoring her parents, and it was one of God's commandments. It was time for her to tell her parents where she was, whether she was pregnant or not. It wouldn't be easy, but necessary. The children brought a smile to Ada's face after they'd finished eating. All of them sat and talked, and the children played on the floor. It was lovely to watch them. While the rest of them talked and enjoyed the spectacle of the children, Mrs. Royal headed back to the kitchen. "I'm going to make us a cake for afternoon tea." "We don't need afternoon tea," Cassandra argued. "We've just eaten a wonderful meal. Why do you think we need more?" "A cake sounds good, Ma." Cameron called to his mother. "Sounds good to me too," Wade said. Ada sighed. "I think I need to learn to make more sweets from you. I am falling short when it comes to satisfying my husband's sweet tooth." For a moment, Wade was certain that Ada had said she fell short in satisfying her husband, and he was shocked. Not only because she was lying to everyone but because she would think that. After a bit, he realized what she'd really said, and had to hide his grin. "Maybe I should pick some berries today," Ada suggested. "Then we'll be ready for jam making in the morning." Bridget looked excited. "You're making jam?" Ada nodded. "Mrs. Royal is going to teach me, but I have to pick the berries." "I'll pick berries with you and be back in the morning for jam lessons." Bridget looked around and her face turned red. "If I'm invited, of course." "You're always invited," Mrs. Royal said with a smile. "We'll have a nice jam-making class, and I'll teach you to make jelly rolls." Wade grinned. "You need to agree to learning to make jelly rolls. Mrs. Royal makes the best jelly rolls this side of the Rockies. I've never tasted anything I enjoy more." Ada laughed. "All right. I'm off to pick berries." Bridget got to her feet as well. "I'll pick berries too." She turned to her husband. "Watch the girls for me." Felix nodded. "I'll watch them." "And you won't let them swallow anything they shouldn't?" He shook his head. "Sarah ate one marble, and you've never let me live it down." Bridget shook her head and took one of the baskets that Cassandra brought them. "I'd offer to go with you, but I think I'm taking this opportunity to nap. With as much as Carter has slept today, I'm certain I won't be allowed to sleep tonight." Ada was halfway out the door when she stopped short. "Where are the berries?" Everyone laughed, and Cameron gave her good directions. As she walked with Bridget, Ada felt the need to talk about the sermon. "I think I have to tell my mother where I am." Bridget nodded. "Why do you think that?" "I probably shouldn't have paid attention to the sermon this morning." "Well, I listened to it as well, and as much as I want to say it makes sense for you to let your parents know where you are, I'm not sure if that's really the case. I've seen your mother with you. I think she'll drag you back to Beckham and make you annul the marriage." "That's what I keep saying, but I feel like I'm doing more harm than good by being here and not telling them. My mother died when I was a little girl, and it was just my father and me until he died a few years ago, and I left Beckham. I can't imagine doing what you've done, but my mother was a kind woman. I don't think she ever would have tried to control my life." They'd walked about 10 minutes before they came upon the berry bushes. They stopped and both women started picking all the berries they could see. "I know my situation is odd," Ada said, popping a ripe blackberry into her mouth. "And I thought I was justified in what I did until I heard the sermon this morning. I need to let my mother know I'm safe." "I can see why you think so." It's probably a good idea even. I just hate the idea of your mother coming here and dragging you back to Massachusetts. I don't have a lot of friends from back home. Have you made other friends here? I have, Bridget said. I'm friends with the several young women with families. I just feel a real connection with you and Cassandra. We grew up in the same area, and all came here as mail-order brides. I feel as if we have more in common than anyone else could possibly understand. I'm sure that's true, Ada sighed. I'll have to keep thinking about it. And talk it over with Wade. He won't like the idea at all, though. Or perhaps he would. He hadn't liked it at all when she'd told him she'd left without her parents' knowledge or permission. No, he really won't. I think you need to not tell your parents anything, but I don't know if I could live with my conscience if I did the same. I wouldn't want to have to be the one to make that decision. Bridget ate a raspberry and grinned. We're going to be making delicious jam tomorrow. I'm excited. Ada couldn't quit thinking about her dilemma though. Perhaps within a few days the answer would become clear. Chapter 9. The entire way home that evening, Ada was on the precipice of telling Wade how she was feeling about writing to her parents, but she simply couldn't force the words out. She knew she should ask for his input before doing something drastic, but she just couldn't do it. What if he told her to never contact them? She felt like she must, and the error she'd made was something she'd done before marrying him, so she felt as if it was her decision to make regarding what to do. She would write to her parents first thing in the morning. She should probably telegraph them instead, but she couldn't bear the thought of them being there so soon. It would be better if it took a couple of weeks for the letter to arrive and them to learn her true location. When Ada went to bed that night, it was with the determination that she would contact her parents. It was the right thing to do. Monday morning Ada was up before Wade, and she sat down to write the letter that could change everything. As soon as she was done, she put it into the pocket of her apron, and then she started the morning cooking. Wade was stirring before she had the bacon fried, and he dressed and went out to milk the cows and gather the eggs. Knowing things could change in the blink of an eye, Ada was determined to make the most of the time she had with Wade. She made his favorite breakfast and kissed him goodbye before he left for the day. As soon as he was gone, she hitched up the wagon and drove to town. She would rather have ridden one of the horses into town, but she needed a way to be able to take the jars of jam home when they were done making it. As Ada arrived in town, she made sure to go straight to the post office, not that there was much more to the town of Mountain Home than the church and the post office. At least those things were there, and school was held in the church. She handed the letter to the woman at the post office, smiling as she did so. I'm Ada Kelso. I married Wade Kelso last week. It's so nice to meet you. I'm Edna Landry. I have to go, but it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Ada got into the wagon and drove quickly toward the Royals ranch. She didn't want to lose her nerve and tried to get the letter back before it made its way to Beckham. She pulled up to the Royals' house shortly before Bridget did, but she waited outside to help her friend get the children in. They were little enough that it had to be hard to deal with both of them. Bridget took one look at Ada's face and said, "You did it, didn't you? You sent a letter to your parents." Ada nodded, feeling as if she'd done something terrible, but knowing it was the right thing at the same time. She couldn't allow her parents to constantly fret about her. I just dropped it off at the post office in Mountain Home. Oh, Ada. I'll pray that it wasn't a mistake. Ada sighed. Thank you. I think I'll need those prayers. But I had to do something to assuage my guilty conscience. She jumped down and reached for one of the children. Let's go learn to make jam. The letter wasn't mentioned again as the women spent the day making huge pots of jam. Halfway through the day, Mrs. Royal said, I don't think we have enough berries. I'll watch the children. Ada and Bridget took that as their cue to go out and pick more berries, which suited them well. I'm excited to try the huckleberry jelly, Ada said. Bridget nodded. I think huckleberries are too tart, but I have a feeling Mrs. Royal will have a way to make them the most delicious jelly we have ever tasted. I think Mrs. Royal knows everything there is to know about cooking, Ada agreed. I want to learn all I can from her. I hope you're here long enough to learn as much as you'd like to learn, Bridget responded. So do I. They filled both baskets they'd been given with berries before heading back to the house. I wonder how they'd taste if we mixed them all together. Bridget smiled. I think that would be just crazy enough to work well. We could call it wild berry jam. That sounds absolutely delicious to me. When they arrived back at the house, Mrs. Royal had some jam cooled for them to try. I set this aside before putting the rest in jars and putting them into the canning pot. I'll teach you how to do that with this next batch. She looked at the berries they'd brought back and grinned. We're all going to have a good amount of jam to last us through the winter. Not as much as last year, but enough, I would think. We could always come back and do it again, Bridget suggested. Ada nodded. I would love that. We're going to need to leave the jars here to cool and set overnight. I'm sure one of us can bring your share to you later in the week if that works for you, Bridget. I'll volunteer for that task. Ada said. She loved that these women didn't want her to be useless. She was certain she could not return to doing as little as she had before marrying Wade, even if her parents insisted. Sounds good. Let's say you do it Thursday or Friday, and I'll make us a nice lunch. Thursday is better for me, Ada said. I'm doing laundry on Fridays. That's my least favorite chore, Bridget said, shaking her head. I hate every minute of it. I don't blame you, Ada said. It's not my favorite, but I'll do it whenever I need to. I tend to put it off longer than I should, Bridget admitted. Do you ladies want to come back on Wednesday, pick more berries, and put up more jam? Mrs. Royal asked. Cassandra hadn't participated much. According to Mrs. Royal, she'd been up all night with the baby. I would love that, Ada said. She was determined to live every moment she could before her parents arrived, and that meant with friends she'd made there as well as with Wade. Bridget shook her head. I really shouldn't. It's such a long drive, and I'm putting off housework to just be here. That's understandable, Ada said. I'll pick extra berries for you. Mrs. Royal nodded. And I'll send them to you with Ada. I think that's just fine. Bridget looked for a moment as if she was going to refuse, but then she smiled and nodded. Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to do it, Ada said, and she was. It felt good to be able to help others through her hard work. Shortly before lunchtime, Ada headed home to make lunch for Wade. They ate together, and he looked around for the jam. No jam? He asked. She shook her head. We have to let it set. I'm going back this afternoon to make more. Is it all right if we don't have bread with supper? I could come home early, but then we wouldn't get nearly as many jars of jam made. That would be all right, I suppose, he said softly. See if you can talk Mrs. Royal into one of her pies, though. She makes the best pies I've ever eaten. I will. Ada had thought her pies were good when she'd made them with her grandmother, but she knew they wouldn't compare to Mrs. Royal's. Perhaps part of her afternoon could be spent learning to make pies. When he headed back to work, Ada saddled a horse and went to the Royals, happily riding astride. Since she realized she wasn't going to need to have the wagon to bring home the jam, she had no reason not to ride and be comfortable. After the jam making and jelly roll baking were over for the day, Ada rode home and started supper, this time planning a simple beef stew. It was something her grandmother had always made for her, and she enjoyed it so. Mrs. Royal had given her a loaf of bread as she left, saying she knew she hadn't had time to make any. She also gave her a pie and one of the jelly rolls. Ada had thanked the older woman profusely, knowing that having the baked goods would make supper so much better for Wade. When he walked in the door, he sniffed the air and sighed contentedly. Is that beef stew? He asked. She nodded. Yes. It's one of my favorite meals, she said. Good. It's one of mine too. And I love chicken pot pie if you ever feel like making that. Ada smiled. I will make one soon then. It was one of the receipts her grandmother had given her, and she was thrilled to make it for him. It was nice to be able to cook for her husband. Bread? He asked, after washing his hands. I thought there was no time? Mrs. Royal sent it home with me, along with a pie and one of the jelly rolls. That woman is a marvel in the kitchen. I've never seen anyone like her. I thought my grandmother was the best cook in the whole world, until I tried Mrs. Royal's cooking. I'm not complaining even one little bit, he said. I'm going back on Wednesday, and I'll pick berries, and we'll make more jam and pie filling. Mrs. Royal promised to teach me to can my pie filling on Wednesday, and then I can just make a crust and add it. She said she has apple trees as well, and we'll make apple pie filling this fall when the apples are ripe. She felt a pang as she realized she might not be there in the fall. It would make her sad if she wasn't a part of their little community for long. After supper, Ada worked on her dress while Wade milked the cows. She planned to make love with him as soon as he walked back inside. It was the only way she could let him know how much she loved him without words. She couldn't possibly let the words slip out before her parents arrived. It would be too hard to leave if the words had been spoken. No, she'd do what she could to make good memories, but she wasn't about to make leaving harder. Asterisk. Ada counted down every day she had left with Wade before her parents arrived. By her calculations, it would take them between 3 and 4 weeks to arrive, and since they'd already had 1 week, it would be over 5 weeks into their marriage before a letter arrived from her parents or they arrived on her doorstep. It was late on a Friday morning 4 weeks later, when she was hanging her clothes on the line, that a buggy arrived at the ranch. Ada shaded her eyes, not knowing who it was, but then she felt a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. She carefully hung the work shirt she held and wiped her hands on her apron before walking to the carriage to greet them. I see my letter arrived, she said. Ada had apologized profusely for worrying her parents in the letter. She didn't feel the need to apologize again. Why did you run away? Her mother asked, grabbing her in a bear hug. Ada pushed away, feeling almost suffocated by her mother's love. She always had. I needed to live the life I wanted to live. No matter how many times I told you I wouldn't be happy married to a gentleman, you simply told me I was being silly, and that I needed to trust you. Her father sighed. I told you that you were smothering her. I wasn't smothering her. I was helping her to become her best self. Mother reached out and took one of Ada's hands, turning it over to look at the calluses there. You've been working so much harder than anyone should. Ada shook her head. I worked as hard as I should. It's part of being a ranch wife. Not wanting to disappoint her parents, but knowing she had to finish hanging the laundry, she said, Go ahead and go inside. I'm about to fix lunch for Wade and myself, but I need to finish hanging the wash first. Her mother's nose went straight into the air as she walked toward the tiny home her daughter was living in. Richard. She called to her husband when she realized he wasn't following. I'm going to help Ada hang the wash, he said, walking over to his daughter and handing her garments for her to hang, like he'd done for his mother so many years before. Thank you, Ada said softly, smiling at her father. Are you happy here? He asked. Ada nodded. Very happy. I'm in love with my husband, and I was right about the kind of life I need to lead. I'm happy doing the chores and working hard. I would have gone crazy if I'd been forced to sit and do embroidery all day. I won't say that I don't miss being able to sit around on occasion because the amount of work necessary is ridiculous, but this is the life I was meant to live. Then you and I will find a way to convince your mother that this is where you need to be. Her father smiled at her, a slight smile in case her mother was watching. Ada knew as well as her father did that her mother had him kowtowed. "Thank you, Papa," she said, feeling relief spread through her. Now they just had to convince her mother. Chapter 10. Wade returned home for lunch and went straight inside the house, expecting Ada to be waiting for him. Instead, he saw a complete stranger sitting at his table, looking around her as if an insect had just flown up her nose, and she was expecting more. He stopped and stared at her for a moment, finally asking, "May I help you with something?" The woman glared at him, got to her feet, and walked across the tiny house to him, stabbing him in the chest with the pointer finger of her right hand. "You are the man my daughter gave up everything for. What does she see in you? How did you coerce her away from us?" Wade's eyes widened. "You must be Mrs. Applebottom. Don't act like there's even a question of who I am. Unless you have more wives hidden about this house." "Are there more wives?" "You are an evil man, and I'm disgusted by you. Please, sit down. I'm not sure where Ada is, but when she comes inside, we'll talk." Mrs. Applebottom ignored his suggestion to sit. "She is out there washing clothes like some sort of maid. Her beautiful hands are rough and red from all the work she's been made to do living here with you. And now my husband is outside helping her hang clothes, as if he isn't an extremely important man." "I see. Let me go and see if they're ready to come inside." Wade left the house as quickly as he could, not waiting for a response or even for acknowledgement from the woman. He spotted Ada standing with a man and smiling up at him. The clothes basket appeared to be completely empty. "Ada?" he called. Ada turned, a shocked look on her face. "I wasn't expecting you home for a few more minutes. I figured it would be easier just to wait out here and not listen to Mother." "Did you meet her?" She looked afraid of his answer. He nodded. "Lovely woman. She wants to know how many other wives I have here after I've ruined your life." Ada grinned. "This is my papa, Richard Applebottom." Wade walked forward and offered his hand to the older man. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Applebottom. Papa, this is my husband, Wade." The smile she gave him surprised him to his core. How could she possibly be so calm with her parents standing there? She dreaded the moment she had to tell them she'd married. Her father looked back and forth between them, and then said, "I'm going to go inside and see if I can soothe your mother. There are leftover chicken and dumplings in the icebox. Would you put them on the stove for me?" Mr. Applebottom nodded as he headed inside. "I'd be delighted to." As soon as the door closed behind him, Wade turned to Ada. "What are they doing here? How did they find out where you were?" "I sent them a letter." "You what? When?" "About a month ago. After the sermon on honoring your parents. I couldn't let them keep worrying about me, so I wrote to them, telling them where I was and that I was safe and happy." He blinked a few times, trying to fully comprehend the situation. "And you didn't think to tell me this? Are you joking?" "I thought that since I was the one who decided to disappear on my own, I should make this decision myself too. Doesn't that make sense?" He closed his eyes, trying to keep his anger in check. The woman was daft. "It would make sense if you'd told me what you'd done. Why on earth did you keep it a secret?" "I told Bridget," she said softly. "Bridget isn't here to deal with your parents though, is she?" He removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. "I really don't know what you were thinking. I'm sorry." She hadn't considered what she was doing would upset him so much, but it obviously had. His reasons made sense. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "Apparently, you weren't thinking at all." He shook his head as another, more dire thought occurred to him. "Did you tell them where you were so they could come and take you home? Do you not want to be here with me?" "Oh, Wade, please don't think that. I love you, and of course I want to be here." "You love me? Is this how you show it?" He wasn't certain if he should be thrilled to know she loved him or drag her off to the river and push her in. She certainly wasn't making any sense to him. Perhaps the water would help her mind work again. Ada wrapped her arms around his middle. I should have told you. I see that now. I just didn't want you angry with me, and sometimes it's easier to pretend that everything is all right. But now you're angry with me anyway. He sighed, pressing his face into her hair. I'll get over it. But how are we going to convince your parents that they need to leave without you? She looked up at him with a huge smile. Papa said he understands, and he'll help us. Well, that changes things, doesn't it? Wrapping one arm around her, he guided her toward the house. You've told me so much less about him than you have about your mother. That's because I didn't get to see Papa as much. He was always working. Mother was pretty much the only parent I knew well. If I'd had any inkling Papa would help me to escape, I'd have told him what I wanted to do. I'm not sure he'd have let me run off to marry a stranger, but now that it's done, he sees the wisdom in what I did. There was wisdom in what you did, he asked, just before opening the door. As soon as they were inside, Papa called, the dumplings are starting to bubble. I've been stirring them, but I think they're almost ready. Oh, good. Ada ignored her mother as she hurried across the small room to the pot on the stove and checked the heat of the dumplings. They're ready. Go ahead and sit down. I'll serve us. Her mother gasped. My only daughter is serving people. What will become of her? Everyone ignored Mrs. Applebottom as Ada served them each a bowl of the dumplings. I can offer water or fresh milk to drink. Not even wine, her mother asked. No, no wine. Ada took everyone water, and she sat down with them. Wade took her hand in his as he prayed over their meal. It was a simple prayer, but it meant everything to Ada because it meant they were inviting God into their discussion, and only he could keep her mother in check. As soon as we finish eating, I'm going to help you pack your things, and we're going to catch the first train back east, her mother said after taking a bite of the dumplings. These are good. She looked particularly surprised that the food her daughter had cooked was edible. Ada's a wonderful cook, Wade said, smiling at his wife. Even though he was annoyed with her for not telling him she'd written to her parents, he wasn't about to let it show in front of them. How? Mrs. Applebottom asked, taking another bite of the food. Grandmother worked with me every weekend. I didn't just wear my hair down and ride astride. I did so many other things, things that most young women learn. Ada took her first bite of the chicken and dumplings. This got better overnight. Wade nodded. And it was fabulous last night. I'm still taking you home with me, her mother said. Just because you can cook doesn't mean I'm going to let you throw your life away on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Are we even still in the United States? Mr. Applebottom smiled at his wife. Yes, dear. We're in Montana, which became a state a few years back. Well, it's still godforsaken country. I bet Indians are a constant bother. Not at all, ma'am, Wade said. I have seen very few Indians, and the ones I've met have been friendly and happy to trade with white men. They should be. Mrs. Applebottom sighed. Never mind that. You're coming home where you belong, Ada. Ada sat up straight and looked into her mother's eyes. No, I'm not. I'm a married woman now, and I'm happy here. I'm not going anywhere. Her mother's jaw dropped. Richard, offer him a job. Ada's father shrugged. Do you have any desire to have a job in banking back east? Wade shook his head. I'm living out my dream here. I always knew I wanted a ranch out west, and that's exactly what I have. Why would I go out east? Mr. Applebottom looked at his wife. He doesn't want a job, Nancy. He's happy here. He looked at his daughter and winked. I think we should just give them her dowry and go back where we came from. Of course, Ada will need to write regularly, and we would like to be able to come back to see our daughter, if that's all right with you, Wade. Wade finished chewing his bite of food and nodded. I'd like that a great deal. Mrs. Applebottom glared at her husband. See? He only wants her dowry. I meant I would like you to visit, not give me a dowry. Ada and I are doing just fine on our own, he said. Ada smiled sweetly at her mother. I don't need anything more than what I have right here. Mr. Applebottom frowned. You'll take the dowry, he said. I'm insisting upon that. When you're ready to expand your ranch, you will want to have ready capital at hand, and I will provide that. We really don't need your money, sir. You may not need it, but it will come in handy someday. The children will come, and you'll realize this house is too small for more than 2 people. Wade looked down. It was already too small, but he didn't want to admit it. We'll make do. Then put the money into the bank for my grandchildren. I promise the money came from hard work, and it's not tainted in any way. Ada didn't say anything, but she really hoped Wade would take the money. She had no idea how much was in her dowry, but she knew whatever amount would make their lives easier. When Wade glanced at her, she gave a slight nod. All right. We'll accept the money. Thank you. He didn't like that he was accepting money from the people who had forced his wife to run from them to be able to live the life she wanted to live. Mrs. Applebottom frowned. Don't let her stay, Richard. I can't make her leave with us. She's married, and she loves her husband. Why would we think we could make her happy in Massachusetts when she's been miserable there for years? Just like I had to not be a farmer to find my happiness, she needs to be with her rancher. You do want our daughter to be happy, don't you? I do, but I don't want her to be so far away. You can come visit any time you would like, Ada said softly. And I'll write often. We won't keep the children from you. Tears were streaming down her mother's cheeks as she finally nodded. I suppose I have no choice in the matter. Mr. Applebottom shook his head. Neither of us do. It's time we let our daughter be exactly who she wants to be. They stayed most of the afternoon, chatting with Wade about his plans for the ranch. Just before leaving, Mr. Applebottom slipped an envelope into Wade's hands. Ada hugged both of her parents, promising that she would write at least every month. She wasn't a good correspondent, so she didn't feel like she could promise to write more often than that. She knew her own weaknesses. After her parents had driven away, Wade turned to Ada. Please don't ever hide anything from me again. You are a good wife, and I love you, but I will not do well if this type of situation is presented to me often. Ada flew into his arms. You really love me? He chuckled. I really love you. Now promise me no more secrets. She kissed his chin and snuggled into his body, contentedly. No more secrets. He kissed her softly and sighed. I really should get back to work. You only have an hour before supper. There's no point in working that little, is there? Probably not. His gaze caught the envelope he dropped on the table when he caught her. Do you know how much your father gave for your dowry? She shrugged. No idea at all. I didn't even know there was a dowry, though if I'd thought about it, I would have. Look and see. Reaching for the envelope, he opened it, and his jaw dropped. I cannot imagine using this much money in a lifetime. Then you can hire a couple of men and not work so hard, she said. You still will have to work hard, but it would be nice if you didn't have to work 10 hours every day but Sunday. And we could have a bigger house with a water closet. She loved the idea of living the best of both worlds. She could be a rancher's wife, but she could have a little more to work with. It would be wonderful. He chuckled. Look at you. Already spending all this money. I guess I need to get used to the fact that I married a society girl from the East. I guess you do, she said, grinning up at him. Well, I promise I still love you for who you are, not for the money that came by marriage. Good. I wouldn't want it any other way. Epilogue. The new house was built before the baby came, but just barely. Wade worked hard to finish it before her mother arrived to help with her grandchild. Ada stood, looking out over their property, a smile on her face, and a hand on her belly, rubbing the foot that was in her ribs. Thank you for finishing my house, Ada said to Wade. You are most welcome. I knew I couldn't bear for your mother to arrive tomorrow and to immediately start complaining about the tiny house we lived in. Well, she certainly can't do that now. Ada smiled, snuggling her head under his chin. I can't believe she's going to be here for the baby's birth. She really does love you, he said. Even if you're not living the life she wants you to live. I know. And I love her too. I'm just glad I got out before she completely ruined my life. He stroked a hand down her back. Everything was perfect now. Soon, they'd have a child and be a true family.